Okay, seems we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar for the Economics of Cybersecurity course. I was going to say good afternoon, but I guess you guys are joining us from all kinds of different time zones. So welcome, whatever time zone you're in. We have collected a bunch of questions from the forum that we'll try to get through today. Some of them are very hard. I'm not sure how gratifying our answers are going to be for you, but we'll take a shot at it. And also, I expect some questions to show up in the chat list here, in the Q&A panel of the chat itself. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with the first question from the forum. It says, what is the reason that economic models apply to security? Is it because economic value is a dominant factor in security? And what if that changes? Let's say security would become very cheap. That's a very interesting question. It's a very fundamental one. Why does it make sense to look at security from an economic perspective? And of course, yes, cost is an important factor. Anything in business, in organizations, is influenced by cost. Not only direct cost, where you have to pay from some budget to invest in something, but also simply the effects of taking certain actions. And these effects can have costs that are not monetary. They may, for example, involve productivity losses. So why does it then make sense to look at security that way? Well, I think the key is to understand why certain security issues get resolved and others don't. Why certain security measures get adopted and others don't. If you look at the available technologies and you compare them against the existing security problems, you will see that many of them actually have, in a sense, a possible solution, and those solutions are not adopted. Why is that? Well, there the microeconomic concepts that we are using in the course come in, and they are potentially helpful in understanding this. You cannot understand this from the technology itself, right? There is a solution, let's say, of some kind, and the solution itself cannot tell you why it is not being adopted. For that, looking at a concept like incentives and costs is informative. Now, of course, if security measures become cheaper, it may change the equation, but we already know that there are certain very cheap measures that organizations and companies can take that they are not taken. And to understand why they're not taking those, you have to understand their incentives. So the cost, the direct cost itself is not really the only driving factor. But sort of to round up, I would say it's about understanding the decisions that actors make regarding security issues that we try to understand. And that's why the economics perspective can contribute. So I hope that was some sort of an answer that is useful to you. Carlos will take the next question.
Yeah, so that question was coming from Dave, and he asked us, like, are the security level metrics more applicable to calculating benefit achieved, backward looking, as opposed to planning for a level of future benefit? So this question is quite related with the first lecture that we held about the three different variables that we have in our framework. And the point here is like measuring benefits is the hardest variable. So somehow we have to map the incidents to the losses. So in the case of an incident that is happening right now, or an incident that has already happened, when you have to map this incident to a loss, then if you are looking at that incident right now, it will be like a prevented losses. So in that case, this metric will be like looking backwards. But of course, it could also happen that you can predict what kind of level of incidents you are going to have. So for instance, let's assume that you are a company and you are suffering several DDoS attacks. So if this DDoS attack is happening today, so you will be kind of looking backwards. If you don't implement any kind of anti-DDoS measures, the benefit will be DDoS. So you will be having losses right now. So it will be like looking backwards. But of course, if you now implement or you hire like Cloudflare and anti-DDoS measurements, or measures, then you will be able to kind of forecast. So if right now you are having like 300 gigabytes per second of kind of the level of the attack that you are suffering, you will be able to see that trend. And then you can forecast also with the information that is available in the market. So you can see what's the level of the current DDoS attacks that all other companies are suffering. So you will be able somehow to benefit to see which are the prevented losses of hiring this anti-DDoS. So somehow I would say that both metrics. So we have metrics for looking backwards, which are the prevented losses, but also in somehow you are also to kind of forecast which will be the losses that you will be suffering if you don't apply any kind of security level. So yeah, the conclusion here is kind of saying that both kind of metrics will apply. It depends on the case, but of course, it's the hardest of the variables that we have to measure because somehow you are forecasting. So you are measuring something that didn't happen or something that is about to happen. So it's really hard to measure those kind of benefits. So I don't know if you have any pointer.
Yeah, just one small addition to this answer. When I think any metric you can also use to look forward. It basically depends on whether you can extrapolate the metric into the future. And as anybody knows, extrapolation is, let's say, a bit of a hit and miss game. Some types of phenomena you can extrapolate relatively well if you find you have, let's say, a relatively stable incident rate of some kind. Then you can extrapolate a certain level. And then, of course, you can also see to whether you are achieving better results than the predicted level. And that's sort of forward-looking future benefits that you could use for a business case, for example. But yeah, typically extrapolation, forecasting is very hard. So as you've gotten probably from the lectures already the sense that even calculating these metrics for the current situation is very hard, let alone extrapolating them. Okay, let's go to the next question. This is a very specific question that asks for a deeper explanation into two concepts which I used in the last lecture, namely network hygiene and hygiene metrics. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's not a core topic in the lecture itself. This basically refers to ISPs, so to network operators. And you can imagine that if you have that the infrastructure that they run, there are all kinds of controls you would like them to put in place. For example, you would like them to do egress filtering, which is an accepted best practice. You would like them to do to prevent, for example, open DNS resolvers in their network that could be used for amplification of DDoS attacks. And there are a variety of other things. Open mail resolvers, a classic problem for years now. These measures themselves don't tell you directly about the security level of the network, but they do give you a sense of, let's say, the hygiene level of the network, whether people are paying attention to keeping it in good shape and, you know, similar to hygiene, whether they wash their hands after they go to the bathroom, so to speak. It's not directly related to the security level. It more is an indicator of the level of control that the operator has over the network and the degree in which that is focused on security. If you are interested in more of that, more about that topic, I suggest you go to the paper that we've linked to in the reading materials, which will also go into this topic. Okay, so that brings us to the next question of Alan.
Yeah, Alan was asking us, what is the social return of investment for a company to invest into cybersecurity? So that's also related with network hygiene. In fact, so let's put an example for that. As Michelle was talking about egress filtering. So somehow a company doesn't have any kind of incentive, because when you are kind of applying the right filters for source address, IP source address, egress filtering, BCP38, BCP84. So what you are doing is not protecting your own customers, you are protecting other customers from some kind of amplification attacks. So this kind of also a social return of investment of security, because it's not you are not securing your own network, you are securing others people. So let's put another more extreme scenario. Maybe we have a critical infrastructure. We have a nuclear power plant. So let's assume that there is no kind of security. So any kind of attack could happen there. If a power plant is attacked, then everybody will suffer from the disruption. So maybe thousands of people are getting electricity from this kind of power plant. So there are all kinds of social return of investment for any company. Basically, it depends on the business that you are operating, where there will be different kind of returns. Alan also asked about how to measure the return of investment and what kind of the metrics. So in fact, this is the core topic of the next week. So Rainer will be kind of explaining that in depth, but basically to give you an idea of what's going on here, what you have to estimate is the annual loss expectancy. So basically you do that by assuming some function of your losses. So you use utility theory, and then you basically divide these annual losses, which they come into some kind of benefit, and then you divide by the cost that you are having when you are applying and buying new controls for your security company or other kinds of security measures that you are taking. And then you will have some kind of return on investment there. But of course, Rainer will explain that in depth next week.
If that sounded like it's a hard topic, that's because it is. So we're glad to have Rainer on board, who is very well-versed in this area. Okay, so we also have some questions coming in from the Q&A in the app. Let's take one of those. I can actually select those, so you'll see which one we're dealing with. Okay, so the question there, as you can all read, is the Apple versus Cydia example that we used in the lecture seemed to conflate privacy with security. And one can argue that Apple leaks more private data, but Cydia apps may be more likely to have malware-type behavior. Can you comment on the difference? Well, I think Fernando here makes a very valid point. It was a privacy example. It was mostly used because it is rather counterintuitive, this example, in terms of what you think controls that organizations have actually guarantee. And it may indeed be true that in Cydia you have more malware-ridden apps. We do know comparisons between, for example, the Android App Store and the Apple App Store, that Android has a lot more malware-ridden apps because of its more open model than Apple. So yes, I have not seen work on the Cydia App Store looking at malware issues particularly. So I cannot really comment on that, but yes, I think that is a relevant distinction, and the comparison with the Google App Store does suggest that there the model may be slightly more intuitive, where the Apple App Store is less open and has more controls in place and does in fact seem to, I mean, Apple doesn't allow you to sideload apps, as it's called, right? You are not allowed to load apps from other app stores than only Apple's own store, whereas Android devices do allow you to sideload, and it turns out that's also a big infection vector. So good point, Fernando. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's go back to the forum questions. There was a rather intriguing question that asked how to measure or increase collaboration in the context of a cybersecurity public-private partnership. And what are the metrics? Okay, I have to admit I don't fully understand this question. How to increase collaboration in the context of a cybersecurity public-private partnership? There are many ways in which you could do that. And in fact, that is, yeah, I don't know how to answer that in a generic way. We've seen some interesting examples in our own areas that we do work in. For example, in botnet mitigation, over the last couple of years, there have been very interesting public-private initiatives. For example, national anti-botnet centers have been set up. And typically, they are set up driven by two, I would say, incentives. One is that the governments co-fund part of the activity, which is interesting for the ISPs because it takes some of the work out of their hands. And another factor is that the governments have put some pressure on the ISPs, soft pressure, not formal regulation, on the ISPs to actually do more about botnet mitigation. The ISPs, let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, were arguing that this was not a problem they should be solving. In fact, they shouldn't interfere with their customers' machines because of privacy and other reasons. And I think that position has shifted for a variety of reasons, and government pressure was one of them. And this is why in many countries you now see these public-private initiatives to fight botnets. So what are the metrics for increased collaboration? I'm not exactly sure what that part of the question asks. Let me answer it in one way, even if it might not be the correct way. We are, in fact, using metrics to evaluate the impact of these collaborations. So we've recently finished a research paper in which we looked at the question whether countries with such a public-private initiative have lower infection rates in their ISPs than countries who do not have such a public-private partnership in place. And as it turns out, the answer is they do have lower infection rates. So that's good news for the people who put a lot of effort in setting up these partnerships. Okay, so, I see that the next question is also for me. Is there any consensus around what a company, on average, incurs on IT expenses per employee or per corporate function? I'm not sure there's any consensus about this. I did see some numbers that try to calculate average expenditures of companies on IT. I cannot recall the exact numbers here. We could look them up if you're interested in those specific numbers. As far as I know, they are not related to security at all. They are just, let's say, the regular type of investments that companies do in their IT infrastructure. You typically encounter issues here like concepts like total cost of ownership. And I guess most of you are familiar with that concept. So those kinds of calculations are being made. And then, of course, you try to attribute that to your business processes and your employees, and then you have an average rate per employee. The second part of the question is whether anything could be said when you compare those IT expenses for cloud solutions versus legacy or obsolete or redundant systems. I guess that would be non-cloud solutions. I'm not sure about the distinction that's being made here. Well, I'm not familiar with that work, but I would say, let's say at a gut level, that the push towards cloud services is not per se because people believe in their superiority in all respects, definitely not also in terms of security, but that the cost is simply a lot lower than maintaining a lot of these functions yourself. So I think this whole shift towards cloud is, you could argue, some evidence of the fact that they do in fact entail lower IT expenses per employee. Okay, so let's see, where are we? Oh, we're making good headway here. Let's take another question from the QA panel. A question from Oscar. Let's see, what would your opinion be of conducting A/B testing, where you keep trying different analyses in rapid succession and track security response on incident data across different organizations? The question assumes analyses can be successfully automated. Wow, that's a very complicated question, and I don't exactly know what A/B testing means. Now, the idea that you can track the impact of certain countermeasures rapidly and even compare those against different companies, that in fact I think is possible. one area where we're trying to do something like this is in financial fraud. So if you look at different banks and how they're dealing with fraud in their internet banking services, then there is clear evidence that certain countermeasures have a direct impact on the fraud levels. And you can see this not only because the fraud levels go down, but because they go down only for those banks who took that specific countermeasure. One very clear example is that at different moments in time, banks in several European countries made payments to banks in foreign countries turned off by default payments to foreign accounts. And that immediately impacted the number of successful attacks they suffered, because for the criminals, even if they could take over the account of a customer of that bank, it was very hard for them to push the money out of the account into the account of a money mule in another country. So, for example, first Belgium took this countermeasure, the Belgian banks, and their fraud levels went down dramatically. And a year or so later, the Dutch banks took the same countermeasure and showed the same effect, while that drop was not visible in many of the other countries. So yes, that's possible. I hope this is sort of close to what you were talking about. If not, feel free to rephrase the question and submit it again. Okay, let's go to the last question on the forum. Can you check whether there are new questions on the forum?
Yep.
The last question from the forum so far is, are good sources available so we can compare our number of incidents within our industry or within the group of organizations with the same maturity level? Oh, this is actually a question for you, but let me take a shot at starting the answer. So the short answer to this is no, unfortunately. The slightly less short answer is there are some things that are available, and it's getting better. There is some academic research trying to look at incident rates across different companies in the same sector, for example. And there are some new services coming into the market that also promise to do this. I cannot vouch for their effectiveness, but we know of one company, for example, that makes security rankings for organizations. And one way in which they do that is they benchmark the organizations against other organizations like it. So yes, there is stuff being done here. Again, to quote an example from our own work on botnet mitigation, we have actually put a lot of effort into developing metrics on infection levels that we can compare across different ISPs. And that means you have to take into account a lot of the factors that also drive infection levels that have nothing to do with the security practices of the ISP. Like, for example, whether they have more subscribers or not. So yes, if you're an ISP, we can help you directly. If you're another type of company, there may be some metrics available for you, but all of this is really in its infancy at this stage. Okay, thank you for that question. Any new ones on the forum?
No.
Oh, you're still checking. Okay, good. I'll take another one from the Q&A. Let's see. For your experience, do you see any cultural differences to apply the framework metrics we are discussing? For example, some may tolerate more vulnerabilities, some may like more control, etc. That's a great question. I noticed early on in the course, on the forum, one of you made the comment that our examples seemed very much geared towards the Western countries, let's say Europe and the US. And that's true. I have to admit that that is a valid point that's being raised. That a lot of examples are drawn from that because we are most familiar with this. And this also brings in the issue, if you look at this globally, aren't there relevant differences here? And there are. Now, let me give you a very simple example. If you, again, look at infection rates of ISPs, and I'm using that example again and again because we're very familiar with this work, you can see that Asian ISPs, for example, often suffer from higher infection rates, not because the ISP per se is more lax, although it may be, but also because its users have very different practices. They have machines they acquire differently. Often they are running, for example, non-licensed software, and automatic security updates are turned off by default in a larger portion of those cases than you see in the West. Now that directly impacts those metrics. Similarly, you could argue, for example, that countries that are less sensitive in terms of privacy issues, you could predict that also in terms of controls, securing databases, for example, customer databases or medical records or something like that, there may be less of an incentive to invest in those issues. So I think you're absolutely right that there are cultural factors at play here, but I know of very little empirical research into this area. So unfortunately, I don't really have a more specific answer for you there. Okay. Carlos is still browsing the forum, so I'm just going to go and select the next question. Let's see, the question from Paul. If an attack is successful, the attacker will increase this attack, raising the total losses. If an attack is not successful, the attacker will not be interested to continue the attack. How to deal with this aspect in losses prediction and extrapolation? Yes, great question, and a very hard one. So actually, all of these combinations of events, of factors occur. So for example, you might have seen reports arguing over the last couple of years that phishing attacks have gone up. And this is typically measured simply looking at the volume of phishing emails. Now that suggests, as some companies claim, that phishing is more of a threat, that the risk associated with phishing is higher. But there is also some work on the academic side that suggests, well, actually, no, the opposite is more likely to be true, that the actual revenue that attackers get from phishing is going down. And to compensate for this drop in revenue, they increase the volume. So it's basically a race to the bottom among the attackers, rather than scaling up an attack that has been successful. So the increase of attacks doesn't really tell you anything about total losses that are being incurred. That's one thing. Now, how do you then deal with this if you are interested in the prediction of losses? Yeah, that's a very, very hard topic to deal with. Actually, I'm not quite sure what the generic answer to this question is. If the attack is not successful, the attacker will move on. Yes, I mean, for example, we've also looked into the target selection of attackers in the Zeus botnet. It's one of the botnets that has been dominant in the last couple of years. And what we saw there is there were a lot of attacks that were very short-lived, a few weeks at the longest. And then that target was never attacked again, while other targets were attacked all the time. Now, the only way that makes sense is if the attacker didn't really find anything of value. They may have gotten in or not. Maybe the attack failed to begin with. Even if they've gotten in and maybe were able to harvest some data, maybe the data turned out not to be very valuable in the underground economy. And that's also a reason to move on. Yeah, and in that sense, it's very hard to extrapolate what the losses would be in the absence of the security measures you put in place. Maybe if you put more security in place, it doesn't make a difference because what attackers can get from the attack turns out not to be that valuable. So I'm sorry, Paul, that's the best I can offer at this stage. Maybe we can revisit this during the course because I do think it's a very important topic. Okay, some new questions have come in. Let's see, we have been going for half an hour. Our plan was to go at it for about 45 minutes, so I think we're still pretty much on schedule for that. Okay, next question. How is cybersecurity insurance premium calculated? Is there any data showing the impact of taking security insurance on the number of successful attacks? And do insurance providers reduce the risk by requiring preventative measures? Great question. Rainer will talk about insurance next week, but we've actually been looking a little bit into this market. And it's actually quite intriguing because insurance has been seen as a very important part of the mix of dealing with security risk for years now. And that promise has not really been lived up to so far. Now, this is going to sound a bit anecdotal, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. So we had a few conversations with people in the cybersecurity insurance business over the past year, and they basically told us two things. One is there is no formal modeling going on behind the premiums. You know, there are these very advanced mathematical models that are being used in the insurance market. They don't seem to be used here. And the reason is there's really no data to feed these models and get any meaningful outcome. So the insurance premiums that we discussed with those providers were actually basically made up. They put a number that was more or less based on what they think, on a trade-off between what they think customers were willing to pay and the number of customers they're trying to reach, so the uptake of the insurance policy. And one interesting success in this market had been, oh, sorry, my phone is ringing. One interesting success in this market has been to introduce a policy against financial fraud suffered by small and medium enterprise businesses. And the way they dealt with this was they made the insurance policy actually quite cheap. They were not exactly sure how many claims they were going to get, but because it was so cheap, many businesses got the insurance policy. And it turns out, though, that income was substantially higher than the claims they had to compensate. So that there you show, there we can see that it's more a process of trial and error. And in that case, the trial was quite successful. I talked to a big German company a few months ago, and they were one of the leaders in the German market. And I asked them how many companies had taken up their policy. And it was a number that was lower than 100. So even a market leader in Germany, which is by no means a small market, it really didn't make much headway. And the stuff that was covered by the insurance actually tells you why it didn't offer a very attractive proposition, because it didn't really insure the losses. It insured certain follow-up effects. For example, the fact that you have to do notifications to customers, that you maybe have to deal with legal claims, and maybe also have to make PR costs in terms of reputation management. And those costs, yeah, is it really worth insuring those for large companies? Well, less than 100 companies thought it was. So I think that's sort of the state of that market at this moment. Okay, let's go to the next one. Another question from Fernando. Can you comment on the availability, bias, heuristic, and the impact on the creation of the metrics framework? For example, as target was breached via the vendor, should we expect future control frameworks to cover that aspect more? Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm not sure if you want to jump in here. Well, while you think, let me make a very small start with this. I think a lot of this question articulates the issue of interdependencies. So it's one thing to have controls in place yourself, but you will be dependent on the controls of other companies that your IT relies on. And, you know, there are service level agreements that may or may not include security, but I think that is really often not providing you with a good view of to what extent you're exposed to those risks. So I do, in fact, expect that control frameworks will look into this more in the future. But it's a hard topic because, as we explained in the lecture, the vendor will have an incentive to basically sell you their controls. They won't sell you the actual performance of what they're selling you. So the SLA will be geared towards the left of the framework. And that still leaves you as the buyer of that service exposed. So in this case, target. So yes, I think it will receive more attention, but I'm not sure to what extent this will be solved by the market.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on the kind of vendor and what kind of breach do you have, because it depends if you are talking about a firewall that was breached, so maybe you can have just an update. So for instance, that's a case of the NTP resolvers that they are being used for amplification attacks, but yes, with a simple upgrade of the firmware, then you can solve the issue. So I think there you will have several kind of reactions from the vendors. So it depends if you have to incorporate new controls, then all that Michelle was talking about, but maybe it could be solved only with some kind of software or patch. Then I would expect also some kind of control being upgraded or being updated, depending on the type of incident that you were suffering.
Yeah, I mean, you see a little bit of this development in the financial world with PCI and that type of frameworks in place. And we all know that almost all the companies that were breached were actually compliant with that framework. So it's going to be very hard cracking that part of the equation. Let's see, we're going into the last 10 minutes or so of this webinar, and a lot of new questions come in. So that's great. You guys are very enthusiastic. I think this one we can just, yeah, thank you for thanking us. My suggestion would be that you guys, the guys that can actually see the Q&A panel, you vote on which question you would like to see addressed more, and then it will move up. And if you don't vote, I will just go down the list and see how far we get. Let's see. What is your opinion about the insurance policies like Hiscox? Won't it cause companies to take cybercrime not serious anymore? Ah, yes. So this is what we call a moral hazard issue. Oh, that just got voted away. But yeah, moral hazard. So if you're insured, you care less. I don't really expect this to occur because, first of all, insurance companies are very familiar with the problem of moral hazard. And more people predict actually the opposite will happen, that to qualify for the insurance and to qualify for certain premium, insurance companies will require certain controls to be in place. And that gives companies an incentive to apply those controls. So yeah, I think it's more likely to be a force for the better. Okay, you guys are voting like mad. That's great. So let's go to the most upvoted question. How should the internet community tackle issues like BCP38, where the cost of a DDoS attack isn't borne anywhere near the source of it? Yes, this is one of those questions where security economics is really very helpful to understand. This is a classic externalities problem where that actually Carlos already explained earlier, right? Every network that would adopt BCP38, so egress filtering, incurs the cost of adopting it, while the benefits of that measure go to the rest of the internet. So how do you adopt measures like that? It's very hard. One thing that I think might help here is reputation metrics. So that's another area where we do some work. Let's say you find a way in which you can measure which networks are BCP38 compliant. Now, a lot of networks say they are compliant. And in fact, in many ways, BCP38 has become a norm that networks in principle, network operators in principle, want to adhere to. So if you make visible which of those networks actually adhere to it and which don't, you could get, let's say, a name and shame type of mechanism going, where the reputation incentivizes the network operator to adopt this specific measure. And there is some academic evidence that these kinds of reputation mechanisms actually work. There's been some work on spam, for example, where publishing certain spam metrics seemed to have an impact on the companies that were in the list of most spam sending networks. That was an experimental design with real-world data, and it suggested an effect. And I would love to take a shot at BCP38 with the same idea. And we are, in fact, exploring some ways in which we could measure compliance with BCP38 across networks in the world, and then make a nice little map and maybe, for example, get the national certs involved to make this an issue in each of the home countries. In the absence of, for example, reputation pressure or something like that, I don't see how networks are really going to move in that direction. So yeah, great question. Oh, sorry, yeah, I should have clicked that earlier. Pardon me. Next one. Didn't I answer that? I did, yes. Okay. So, Sony, yes. Can you comment on the Sony attacks? How can this increase awareness for cybersecurity and how to measure the losses for Sony? Yes. You know, many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with Bruce Schneier, and he has actually written a few blog posts on his website, schneier.com, that, you know, I think summarize the issue very well. I think in many ways what Sony went through, almost all companies of that type, of that size, would be vulnerable to. It's simply a function of the complexity of running IT at a scale like that. Now, apparently they were a bit worse than their peers. Okay, that might be the case. But this kind of opportunistic attack is very hard to defend against, right? These guys did not have a certain purpose. They weren't trying to funnel money out in a specific way that you envision beforehand when doing your vulnerability analysis. They were opportunistic. They were just trying to create as much reputation damage as possible. And even, you know, personal emails, which have no value in any monetary sense, were worthwhile a target for them because they made the company look bad. They made them look foolish. So how do you measure that? Yes, well, it's very, very hard to quantify. There has been some work in the past that looked at stock markets to get a sense of what the reputation impact was on the rate of a stock of a company when it had to disclose breaches. And those impacts were quite substantial. You know, I remember figures like 2, 3, 4% of stock price losses. And those are, you know, that's a significant amount of money you're talking about. Now, what we don't know is whether those losses are actually permanent or whether they are short-lived and transient. So that's something for future research to pick up. Anything to add?
Yeah.
No? Okay, thank you for that question. Let's go to the next one. DDoS attacks on banks and other security incidents have occurred. To what extent would you see a need to introduce government policies on critical infrastructures? Yes. Banks sell trust and may have contradictory incentives. Yeah, this is a topic I am typically debating with a lot of people. And let's say I'm typically in the minority position here. So a lot of people think two things. First of all, that the incentives of companies working in critical infrastructures are too weak for them to invest in security because they don't take into account all the social costs and benefits of their failure. That's argument one, and there is good, you know, there's good backing for that argument. The second argument is that if you look at these attacks that they've been suffering, then you have to conclude that they are not doing enough, and therefore this proves the first point, that their incentives are too weak. Now, the last part I disagree with. Now, in the Netherlands, we had about a year ago, or maybe even longer, I cannot recall the exact time frame, a whole wave of DDoS attacks against the banks, and we had actually major outages in that respect. Now, the overall response to this was, look, this proves that the banks did not care and they did not invest enough. And I actually disagree with that, because you have to look at what the banks actually lost and what the societal losses were here. Now, in direct cost, the losses were very moderate. Even sort of hyperbolic estimates that online merchants came up with, put the cost at just, a few million euro at most. Now, if all these banks acquire much higher grades of mitigation protection services from companies like Ann Arbor and others, Arbor Networks and others, that easily costs them in the same price range, okay? So you have to wonder whether it's rational to actually buy these services, because in the end, of course, as customers, we will simply pay for all of this. And I think it's unclear whether they save more money by mitigating than just accepting a certain, number of hours of outages in the course of a year. Now, of course, the big missing part here is trust. And a lot of experts were saying, well, yes, okay, maybe the direct damages are not that large, but this undermines people's trust in financial services. Now, I don't fully buy that argument, in the sense that if you look at the response of consumers, actually consumers didn't respond at all. And there was this one sort of interesting anecdote where a Dutch national television news show tried to make a huge news item out of this, and it was like a huge attack on the financial service. And then they had also interviews with regular people in the street, as TV shows tend to do. And none of these people were worried. All of them assumed, yeah, okay, it doesn't work now, but tomorrow it will be fixed, no problem. So they were actually much more rational than the experts who thought that people will, get scared and do bank runs and stuff like that. So I'm skeptic as to whether, especially for DDoS attacks, we should demand that banks do more. I think they're actually probably rather overspending rather than underspending. Okay, we are really out of time. Do you have any final words?
I would just suggest the people to add those to the forum so that we can answer them.
Oh, that's a great suggestion, yes. So there are a bunch of questions here that we didn't get to. Carlos's suggestion is to add those to the forum. So copy paste them to the forum and we'll try to get to them there. That's a great suggestion. Thank you all very much for listening. We hope it was helpful. And there will be another webinar with Rainer Böhme scheduled next week, and we will let you know as soon as possible the exact time and frame for that webinar. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you.